As Ted said, I'm Director of Asset Management for Northern Ireland Water, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our little domestic problems in 2010-11 and what has been done to improve the resilience of our service since then. Now, it does seem to be a little bit of a Northern Ireland session. We first had Liam, who's definitely got you used to the Northern Irish accent. I think Mark's probably got an Irish grandmother. That's where we get most of our rugby players from. So, when I went down to do the technology, actually Aidan's from Derry, Londonderry. So we're taking over. We used to come over and do the roads for you, but now it seems we do the conferences. So we're moving up the value chain. I'm going to give you a little bit about the background to Northern Ireland Water. I'm going to talk about the free-thaw event of 2010-11, which many of you will be aware of. A little bit about the lessons learned and how we've implemented the solutions. I'm going to talk about extreme events and just a couple of passing thoughts from a sinner, as somebody who's been through this. I mean, it was a disaster, and for other people, it's always good to watch other people's disasters. There's something in the psyche which makes us watch those videos on YouTube. But it certainly was a crisis for Northern Ireland Water. I was in New Zealand at the time, so I was actually on holiday over the Christmas period with my wife, and it managed to hit the New Zealand press. I knew there was something major going on at home at that stage. And it's really nice to be able to come back 2 years later and actually tell you what's been done and how we've actually built on this crisis. So for any of you who haven't been across the pond or across the Irish Sea, Northern Ireland Water, very similar in scale to Southwest Water, you'll be familiar to, and some of you will have heard Nigel Annette, the MD of Welsh Water. We're about half the size of Welsh Water. Population of about 1.8 million, and predominantly rural, with two large conurbations, basically Belfast and Derry, Londonderry. So that gives you a little bit of a feeling for it, and I recommend it as a destination. Don't be put off by the news. So the 10-11 free-thaw event, I'm going to give you a little bit of background to it, and Mark has helpfully given me a few introductions here, because it really was an extreme event. This on the screen is the maximum daytime temperatures. So that's the maximum daytime temperatures for a couple of places in Northern Ireland. One in the east, Aldergrove, the airport, if some of you know it, and in west in Castledurg. So it was the freeze-thaw event, and the extremely cold temperatures were across the whole province. So we had, as you look on the right, a very sustained period of cold temperatures where the maximum daytime temperature didn't get above 0 degrees for about 10 days. And then very suddenly a thaw event. So the maximum temperature increased by 17 degrees within 24 hours. And if you're running a water network, that's really put some strains on it. So it was a combination of those extremely low temperatures for a sustained period and then a very rapid thaw, which really caused the problem. And what was the problem? Well, this little graph just shows service reservoirs, and I know some of you won't be from the water industries, but essentially you collect it in large reservoirs, you treat it through a bulk treatment process, and then you store it in service reservoirs. So we have about 350 service reservoirs around the whole of Northern Ireland of various sizes. And what this shows is how deep the water was in the service reservoirs at midnight. And at midnight, you expect your minimum demand, you expect your service reservoirs to be full. So you can see the graph bumping along with 2 or 3 service reservoirs having problems. On the 26th, there were 6 service reservoirs less than half a metre deep, which is essentially empty. 27th, there were 31. By the 28th, there were 64. And by the 29th, there were 70 of our service reservoirs were empty when you expect them to be full. And obviously, they can't supply customers at that stage. Now, the recovery happened relatively quickly, and that was done by limiting the supply, i.e. turning off the supply to customers. And that had to be done really to protect hospitals, because if your hospitals start to run out of water, then you're in a real problem. Now, I call this slightly tongue-in-cheek called managing the event, because honestly, we didn't manage it. It got completely out of control. And the real problem about it, and I'll explain this a little bit more, was about 80% of the water was being lost on the customer side. It was basically pissing out through an empty hose. So the more we put in, the more disappeared out the far end. And I'll explain why that was such a problem. Huge losses. So even though we increased the supply very significantly, we couldn't keep up with the demand because it was just pissing out. The second element is the dealing with the stakeholders and the stakeholder management, and certainly some lessons learned there which we've taken on board. And the third really big thing is if you have a problem and your customers can't contact you, you have a real problem. And so it was the communication side which was really our Achilles heel. So if I just translate that into numbers so you can get a feel for it. This is our website over that period, and it's designed to deal with about 20,000 hits per day. That's what it's designed for. The average was about 500 per day. Maximum number of visits was about 6,500 when we had a particular event in April 2009. On 29th of December, 145,000 people tried to access the website. Now, that's in the order of 10% of the population. Now, the website actually thought it was being attacked. The software was designed to deal with an attack, and so the website was working, but it closed itself down because of that extreme approach. Now, that can be dealt with fairly quickly, but even when we could get people to access the website, it was very difficult to get the information they wanted onto that website unless you have your systems in place beforehand. If you can't get on the website, what do? Well, you try and ring the call center. So this is the call center on the period, and you can see the date down the left-hand side. On the 24th, about nearly 4,000 people rang, and that was mainly because it was the freeze period. They turned on their tap and they couldn't get any water because their service pipe was frozen. And just to the right of it, you'll see the number of engaged calls, and that was 0. People weren't so interested on Christmas Day. It dropped it down to about 1,600. On the 26th, things were starting to happen. It went up to about 6,000. And then on the 27th, we were on 266,000 people trying to ring our call center. And surprisingly enough, 257,000 of those got an engaged tone. And it got slightly worse to the next day when we had 403,000 people trying to contact us, and very few of them actually even got through. Now, you may think, what on earth were we doing? Actually, if you look to the column to the right, the number of calls that we were dealing with was increasing dramatically, but just the capacity wasn't there. We didn't have enough phone lines to actually answer them, and even when we got the people in there who could answer the phones, we were never going to be able to deal with that level of demand. Now, looking at 400,000 people trying to call, the absolute maximum people who were out of supply at any one time was about 70,000. So that's a huge number of repeat calls. People would just repeat, and that generated a lot of frustration. I think I've described the problem, that it was really huge losses from the customer side. What went well? Well, actually, the assets performed reasonably well. You would expect me to say that as Director of Asset Management, but actually that's what the independent report said. We increased the water supply about 40%, so nearly an increase of half, but that wasn't ever going to actually deal with the demand. Distribution system is very badly affected by very cold weather. Pipes don't like it. So we had about 3 times the number of bursts that we would normally expect. But that actually wasn't a problem. We were able to mobilize contractors and get staff out and fix those bursts very quickly. We couldn't deal with the customer side where all the water was disappearing. Our staff were brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and really everybody turned out and worked all hours of the day, but they got exhausted quite quickly. 3 days working in some sub-zero temperatures, you really exhaust you. We had a lot of friends. The water industry is actually a very friendly industry, partly because it's a monopoly, so we're not really competing against each other. And people were very helpful. The Water UK scheme worked well, and Scottish Water were very helpful and provide bottled waters, and many others, where they could. Everybody was suffering, but there was a lot of help. And our major incident plan, which is designed for these, actually generally worked well. All the systems sat up and worked, but we couldn't actually meet the demand and we couldn't communicate. So what didn't work well? Well, individuals worked very well in adversity, but the call center and the website, as I've shown, weren't up to it. Media and the stakeholders, and I'll do a little video in a minute, but it's an absolute vicious spiral. You can't actually deal with the media are insatiable. And they want bad news stories. I'm afraid that's what they want. This is the time you beg for a royal baby. Give me a royal baby, please. The other thing I can't mention was the information management. And actually, we have systems and all spreadsheets and where the incidents are all happen. Try to get that to your customers if you can't communicate with them on your website. So information management is very, very challenging. Okay, that's the disaster side over. I can breathe a sigh of relief. These are the lessons learned and what's actually been implemented. And I'll start with the first side, which is the customer side leakage, because that is the real issue. And that's the scary thing, whether you're in water or power or gas. If you can't actually deal with what your customers need, then you're going to be in a problem as a business. Even if you can communicate with them, what are you going to tell them? Sorry, we can't supply you. It's not actually a good system. So we knew we had to deal with that 80%. So we did it in a lot of different ways, and the first was a conventional advertising campaign. If it happened again, we would not be able to deal with the supply. We wouldn't be able to supply because our systems aren't in place to double the amount of water. You can't have a little water treatment works with a whole reservoir system just waiting for a 1 in 100-year event. So we had to change the culture. We had to change people's approach. And we used lots of approaches, and advertising, I say, is the first one. So we had a television campaign, so you got this between Coronation Street, the Winterproof Your Home, radio, buses, advertising, hoardings, newspaper advertising, your conventional broadsheets and the local newspapers. And it was all about this idea of winterproof your home. And we tried to target all sectors. And we've got a very large rural community, as I mentioned, so there was winterproof your farm. And the farmers were a particular, I shouldn't say problem, but they were difficulty within the freeze-thaw, because if you've got a shed load of chickens and you have no water, you have a problem. So there were really upset farmers ringing the call center trying to work out how they could get supplies for their animals. And we worked very closely with the Ulster Farmers Union to be able to actually target that. Part of the problem was many farmers turned the taps on and ran their taps to waste in order to prevent their supplies freezing. So the cause of the problem and the actual problem were linked. So getting them to winterproof their home and put their supplies in deep enough underground was an important thing. And we spent about £400,000 just on that advertising campaign. Secondly, we really wanted to keep that message going, and we approached it through a PR campaign and below-the-line advertising. And here's a picture of the current Minister for Regional Development, Danny Kennedy, on the right, and our Director of Customer Service, Sarah Venning, on the left. And they've got a pipe and some insulation and a little tag to put on your stop valve. Why do we have that? Because many people don't know where the stop valve are. Everybody will be thinking now, do I know where my stop valve is? But lots of people didn't. So when the water was pissing down the walls, they didn't know how to actually turn it off in their house or in their school or in their farm. Web campaign we used on website, which was very much upgraded. And Twitter especially was a very strong way of doing it. And that's the website with Winterproof Your Home. Stakeholders. Now, this is a place you never want to be, and Aidan, if you wouldn't mind just running the video for me there. This is on the 30th of December, and I think it's Peter Robinson on the left, Martin McGuinness on the right.
Executive meetings that we've had for a very long period of time, and to say that there was an expression of very serious concern around the table would be to put it very mildly. A number of ministers were quite rightly angry about the performance of Northern Ireland Water. It isn't simply a case of Had, I think, one of the most serious executive meetings that we've had for a very long period of time, and to say that there was an expression of very serious concern around the table would be to put it very mildly. A number of ministers were quite rightly angry about the performance of Northern Ireland Water. It isn't simply a case of underperforming. We believe that it has been shambolic at stages. It has been ineffective. It has not been the kind of organisation that is fit for purpose. And those are issues that we will look at very clearly in the long term.
Thanks, Aidan. Very unfair and very unhelpful. But that's politicians. And that was the middle of the campaign. That was the middle of the problem. So some of our staff actually took off their Northern Ireland Water jackets and wouldn't wear them in public because they were just getting this sort of abuse. But there's no point in complaining. So we've done a lot around our stakeholder campaign with politicians, obviously, and farmers, working with key stakeholders, so regulators, businesses, etc., engaging through our business as usual contacts, such as myself and also our comms team. We've gone to our political agencies and party conferences and school visits, because actually your children are probably more receptive than you are to these messages. Dealing with the website, so an awful lot of web development. Previously designed for 20,000 visits a day, it now will deal with 200,000 an hour. So you will always be able to get on the website. And there was a new website design to go with it, which also took the opportunity of building on the old website and actually add more services as we could. And it's, as Mark had said, really taking the opportunity to build from the ground up. The issue with call handling, we now have a high volume call and handling system in place. So we'll actually deal with virtually any amount of calls, up to 10,000 calls per hour, and no customer will get an engaged tone. And also the systems behind that to provide the information from the field. So a couple of thoughts just as I leave you. About extreme events and climate change. And Mark mentioned that the Met Office said that 1 in 100-year events are now going to be occurring every 10 years or so. Now that really affects us as utility suppliers: drought, flooding and freezing. These are the UK climate change projections. You will have seen these before: increase in temperature, etc. But I pick up the one in red at the bottom is the change in intensity or frequency of other extremes. And as a water supplier, that's the one that keeps me awake at night. So we've seen, over a relatively short period, flooding and 7 months later into a drought, and freezing, and 5 months later into our catchments actually burning. And you can see the satellite image of the smoke coming off the catchments. So my parting thoughts. December 2010 was the coldest month in over 100 years. April 11 was the warmest April on record. So these are from a sinner. I've been there. I think I've earned the T-shirt. But have you checked your risk register recently for 1 in 100-year events? You don't tend to. And when was the last time you ran a really major incident rehearsal where you tested your systems to breaking point? And breaking point for freezing, flooding, fire, drought, and pestilence. So I wish you well. Thank you.